Hello, and welcome to the Networking Capital video. Ever wonder how much cash you need to grow your business? Well, networking capital is the answer. This video will show you how to calculate your networking capital and how to understand what type of cash you need to reach your goals and growth targets. Topics we'll discuss will include what is networking capital and how is it calculated, how networking capital affects your valuation, and what are the core drivers of good networking capital management. Before we get into it, I wanted to share an ancient exit strategy proverb. The good news is that you already understand networking capital. Networking capital is the reason you don't ever seem to have any cash, even though you're profitable. So maybe it's a good time to find out why. So if you're already having cash flow problems and not understanding why you don't have enough cash to grow, you've probably also scratched upon the surface of what networking capital actually is. So let's get into it. So why is networking capital so important? First, it lets you know what cash you need today. So it'll give you a clear indication of what your capital requirements are to run your business in its current environment from day-to-day operations. Also, it'll let you know what cash you need tomorrow. So what more cash you will need to hit your goals. So for example, if you want to double in size, it'll let you know what type of cash you need to achieve those goals. And lastly, it'll increase your purchase price. So in addition to the enterprise value be getting at close, which is your TTM earnings times your multiple, it'll also get you paid more in a transaction if you have a built out asset on your balance sheet. It'll really show that you have good networking capital management. So what is networking capital and how do you calculate it? You may have heard that classic definition that networking capital is your current assets minus your current liabilities on your balance sheet, which is true, but just to get a little bit more granular, it's actually a measurement of your company's liquidity and your ability to pay off your short-term obligations. It gives a good indication of the cash needed to run your business and fulfill your day-to-day daily operations and duties. Now, there's a term cash-free, debt-free transaction to get to your networking capital. This is a structure we often hear when we're negotiating with buyers, and this pretty much means just that, cash-free, debt-free. So any cash that you have on your balance sheet prior to close will be yours to keep. The buyer won't be assuming that cash. But on the flip side, any outstanding debt liabilities that you have will also be your responsibility to extinguish. Inventory will also be a hot topic when you're negotiating terms with a buyer. The concept of inventory is that it's not necessarily going to always be included in the networking capital. In fact, most buyers will take that out of the networking capital calculation, the inventory on hand, also the supplier payables, and they'll pay that separately. So it's also a good idea just to keep in your mind, when you're talking to buyers and you're going through the process of exiting, to keep in mind how much inventory you do have currently, because that will come into play when you're speaking to buyers, and you do want to hopefully get paid out for the inventory you have on hand. But again, it's typically separate from the networking capital calculation. Here's just a takeaway for you, an action item. Have your bookkeeper review your balance sheet with you each month to show how networking capital works. And they'll walk you through the basics of it. And month after month, as you pick up on this, you'll be really in a good position to understand your cash flow and what's needed to run your company. Let's further expand on these topics and talk about how networking capital affects your valuation. Once again, networking capital is the current assets minus the current liabilities. But let's just define these terms. So current assets would be the amounts that are owed to you but have not yet been converted to cash. A great example here would be the Amazon payout that you receive every 2 weeks. Also, your current liabilities are amounts you owe but have not yet paid. A good example here would be an ad agency bill. The cash-free, debt-free concept, if your structure is set up like this, it's going to be that you get to keep all the cash on your balance sheet day of close, but also, again, you have to make sure that you extinguish all the debt, the liability. Just like the buyer isn't going to take your cash from you, they're also not going to settle all your debt. So the difference between these two amounts is what the adjustment is, and you keep the net of these two amounts. The net inventory at landed cost, that's going to be your gross inventory value minus your amounts owed. And the gross inventory value is anything that you put into the product to make it sellable. So for example, it's going to be the raw materials, the shipping, all of the landed costs to get that product up and running to sell. The amounts owed are typically going to be, what you had to pay to make that product sellable. So for example, most commonly, it's going to be the supplier payables that you owe. And net inventory value Although it's ideal to have that added to the purchase price during the transaction, but that's not always the case. That's definitely something you'll want to try to negotiate, but it's not 100% sure that you're going to actually achieve that, but definitely push for that and keep an eye on your inventory levels to make sure you know where they stand. To further illustrate the concept of net working capital, here's a balance sheet. And as you recall, balance sheets end at a specific point of time, whether it be the month, the quarter, the year end, but this is what they typically will look like. And in relation to your net working capital, you will need to pull things off of your balance sheet to calculate your net working capital. So for example, to get your total current assets, you'll need your accounts receivable and your inventory. Your current liabilities will be your accounts payable and your credit cards payable. And that'll get you to your net working capital number. And then there's also the concept of, targeting your net working capital, whether it be the average of 12 months, the average of 4 months. You can come up with these net working capital targets. And this example just shows you that to understand net working capital, you will also have to understand how the balance sheet works. And more importantly here, it's ideal that you go back to your bookkeeper or your accountant to make sure you understand the way that flows and how the balance sheet actually pertains to net working capital. It's a good idea to review this monthly with your accountant and bookkeeper until you understand your cash flow needs and how the balance sheet actually plays a major part in your net working capital figures. Let's talk about the core drivers of good net working capital management, with the first one being inventory efficiency. There's a concept of inventory turnover, which means how many times a year you convert your inventory into cash. And generally speaking, the more times you could do this, the more profitable your business will be, the more cash flow you'll have. You'll turn your inventory into cash and put it into your bank account. So obviously, the more times you could do that each year, the better. So let's calculate inventory turn. The first thing you're going to do is take your trailing 12 months of COGS. In this example, it's about $500,000. Next, you're going to get your inventory asset beginning amount and ending amount. And in this case, it's about $300,000 plus $200,000. You'll take that number and divide by 2 to get your TTM average inventory. Next, you're going to divide the COGS by the TTM average inventory amount of the $250. And at that point, you'll get your turn ratio of 2. Next thing what you want to do with that ratio is convert it into actual days and months. So step 1 here is you're going to divide 1 by that inventory turn ratio. So 1 divided by 2 is 0.5 in our example. And next, you're going to multiply that by 365. So with that, we come up with days of inventory of 183. Next, to convert that to months, you're going to divide 30 days by 183, and that'll give you a good indication of how many months your inventory turns over. So that's about 6 months, which we kind of knew because if you turn over your inventory twice a year, that does equate to every 6 months. Now, this will give you a good indication of how often you'll turn your inventory over, which results in getting actual cash. And then you take that cash and you can plan your next inventory purchases. So the more times you turn over your inventory, the more liquid you would be. Let's talk about core driver number 2, which is all around supplier payment terms. I want to show you why it's actually a good thing if you owe your suppliers money if managed properly. So for example, if you have a $4 million TTM revenue business, there's 2 options in this scenario to actually pay your supplier. One's going to be to pay the supplier upfront 100% for your inventory. And the other scenario is going to be where you pay your supplier not until goods are actually sold. So to show you the net working capital calculation between these two, we're going to take the current assets minus the current liabilities. In the first scenario, you've paid for that $500,000 of inventory upfront. Therefore, there's no payable. So your net working capital at that point is $500,000. In the second scenario, you could see how you have that $500,000 of inventory, but you haven't yet paid for it. So your net working capital is going to be 0, the $500,000 minus the $500,000. So looking at these scenarios, having 0 net working capital is going to be much better than having a $500,000 net working capital requirement. So the more you owe the supplier, the lower your net working capital number will be because you're subtracting your payables from your inventory. Keep in mind that net working capital is a measure of how much you need to grow. So in this scenario, looking at the first option, if you double it, you're going to need $1 million of working capital. Whereas the second scenario, although it may seem a bit extreme, it's showing that for this same, if you double that, you'll need 0 working capital. So you'll need 0 cash to double in option B. So therefore, it's the better option. So hopefully this illustrates how net working capital works in relation to supplier payables. Let's combine those 2 core drivers of good net working capital management. So if you have both good turn and favorable supplier terms, you will increase your exit valuation. So having higher inventory turn is better as long as you don't have any stockouts. With lower inventory turn, it suggests that you have excess inventory and your revenue that you expected is not coming in, two things that you don't want to deal with. And the way to combat against that is having a good forecasting process in place so that you'll know how much inventory and when to order it. Negotiating better supplier terms is a long-term process. It's not a one-time event, so it'll become easier as you do develop longer relationships with your supplier. And don't forget, every dollar they finance is a dollar that you don't have to borrow. And watch out for slow payments from wholesale customers. We see this quite often. It can really hurt your net working capital and your cash flow efficiencies. And depending on how your deal is structured, better net working capital efficiency may directly lead to more cash for you. Because at the end of the day, buyers want to buy companies that are running an efficient business. So the less money they need to put into the business, the more money they can pay you. So it'll look much more desirable if you have a good grasp on your net working capital management. So here's an action item for you. Add net working capital and inventory efficiency analysis to your monthly review. You should be doing an ongoing monthly process of your net working capital to ensure that your appropriate levels are achieved. I wanted to share with you a quick quote from the EOS website that really applies to the concept of net working capital. It reads, "It's the boring stuff that leads to greatness." So a lot of people do say that the concept and the basics of net working capital are quite boring. But as you've seen, if you don't monitor your net working capital or have any indication of what it is, you can never achieve those growth targets. You'll really never achieve that greatness that your business needs. And here's a northbound exit principle to share with you. How important is net working capital? Let's just say if the first day that you focus on understand net working capital is when the buyer shows you their calculation of it during the transaction, you almost certainly lost out on money that you could have received. So point being here is don't wait till the last minute to get into a transaction with a buyer to discover what your net working capital requirements are. Make sure you do that ahead of time to get that premium valuation that you deserve. Just a quick recap on net working capital. Net working capital shows you how much it takes to run your business. It also helps you understand how much cash you need to fund your growth. A business with strong net working capital management is definitely desirable to buyers as it requires less cash to fund your growth. So I'm hoping after you watch this video, you understand the importance of getting a grasp on net working capital and what it means for the valuation of your company. Thank you.